I remember in the mid 90s, around 95, 96, David Lee Roth was called me and he wanted to put together a band to do Van Halen songs. And he went on and on about how that we were the only guys who could really do it right, and he had all these crazy plans. And I said, I, I said, but Dave, Ed's still alive.
My guest today is undeniably one of the greatest guitarists of all time. As a player, he effectively put the instrumental rock genre on the map in the 1980s, and recently he's been enlisted by Sammy Hagar to be a part of his Best of Both Worlds tour, which is a celebration of Sammy's solo career, his work with Montrose, Chickenfoot, and of course Van Halen. They'll be bringing this tour to the UK in July. It's Joe Satriani. Joe, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. So great to see you again. Now, you have been bringing your talents to the UK for decades, sir, but you've managed to convince, I'm giving you the credit, Sammy, to come back over finally. Obviously, you brought Chickenfoot over here like many times and it was amazing, but to get to hear Sammy's music and you guys bringing it all to life. Talk us through the excitement bringing that over to the UK, because I know you've been having a lot of fun with the tour.
Yeah, it's a great show. I still have a thrill when we start the show and I look over there and there's Sammy Hagar and there's Michael Anthony and I'm on stage with them and it's like, wow, this is like a pinch me moment again. It's they bring with them all the history and the mystery and the crazy rock and roll fun of all the music that I grew up listening to, and especially since we share so many of the same roots, it makes the experience that much more powerful. And I know that people feel it because we've been touring quite a bit for the last 2 years, and I experienced it, like you said, with Chickenfoot, and they always bring it. They just bring this power and energy and all that they lived through and all the music they've created. They bring it down to bear at every show.
Taking it right back, when did you first get sort of turned on to Sammy's talents?
Oh, well, he was just all around all the time. When I started growing up playing guitar, there was Montrose. So, we knew Sammy as the singer mainly. And then slowly we started to understand that he was writing a lot of the music. And then of course when he became a solo artist, he he really hit a nerve, and it's interesting. Those records are really diverse. Um, and it was always I always thought that one of the coolest things about his guitar playing was that he somehow took that knowledge of being a really good lead vocalist and applied it to the way he played guitar. And he's kind of a crazy shred guitar player on the one hand, but on the other hand, he's got this editorial process that I personally recognize as being a lead singer thing. Like they don't like I'll play too many notes, but he won't, And I always ask him, well, what is that? And he, of course, he doesn't think about it. It's totally natural to him. He's just a completely natural player. But he somehow plays the right notes with the right kind of vibrato, and that still fascinates me as it did when I was a young kid growing up. And I was thinking, wow, restraint. Like there aren't many American guitar players that are well known for restraint. You know what I mean? I always saw that as a sort of something that would come from the UK or Ireland or something. That you have these players like Clapton or Brian May who just play the perfect notes, and they don't turn the amp up to 11, and they don't play things I can't really play. That's but although I'd say Jimmy Page is maybe the exception. But Sam had this thing that was because he really liked Clapton. I think he would take that one step back from the edge of the cliff, and make sure that he could pull it off. But I hear it over and over again as a thing that really good lead vocalists have, and they apply it to their guitar playing.
I would imagine not, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Was there anything that you
Yeah.
struggled with the guitar early on?
Oh, still do. Yeah. One of the things you learn when you teach guitar a lot is that kids walk in week after week who can do certain techniques way better than you'll ever do, and it's just human nature. You know, you look at the Olympics and you see all of them are fantastic athletes, but they're all specialized. The person who can run and jump is not necessarily going to be a good uh, pole vaulter, and swimmers, may not be good sprinters, and musicians are the same way. We're just using our bodies, and every body is different. And you know, s- I it didn't bother me so much because I guess at the time that I started playing, there were examples of guitar players that were so uniquely different. Like we mentioned them, like Hendrix and Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton, uh, Pete Townsend, obviously Keith Richards and George Harrison. These were the guitar players that I grew up listening to because of when I was born, and along with the early rock and roll guitar players and blues guitar players. But I also heard a lot of jazz guitar players because my parents were jazz age kids. So, I'd hear in one day, I'd hear the Dave Clark Five coming from my sister's room, and I'd hear um, Wes Montgomery coming from my parents' room, and my brother would be playing Chuck Berry or Muddy Waters, and my other sister would be listening to Led Zeppelin, and it was really a fantastic upbringing to be exposed to so many different kinds of guitar players who created magic, but who obviously had different talents. And specific to guitar, some of them could play really fast, and some of them couldn't. And some of them were great at rhythm, and some of them weren't. So it's like very early on, I thought there's no way that I'm ever going to say that Jeff Beck and Pete Townsend, like one is better than the other. To me, they are both totally magical, and they have these gifts that nobody else has. And so I started to look inward and say, okay, forget about, just take whatever you got to its logical high point, and then forget about it, and then concentrate on the musical part, the magical part, because that's what's moving me, not the fact that one guy can play faster than the other, uh, or stretch his fingers longer than the other. I realized as a listener, I don't care.
Was that something that you always applied even in practice? Because obviously, when you've managed to get on stage and you're playing in front of people, the best performances come from like you're too busy doing it to be bogged down with thinking about it or thinking about
Yeah,
mistakes or any of that stuff. But sometimes that's
yeah,
a little bit harder to recreate in the practice room, when the pressure's there, that red light fever's
yeah,
not there. Was that something
yeah.
that you realised, well, every time I pick up the instrument, I need to be saying something with it?
I think in the early days, well, there's two things, and I wanted to make a point that the it's important the first year or so that you push yourself physically, um, to see what you got, to see how coordinated you are. And during that period of time, you really do have to learn every chord, every note, every scale. Otherwise, you don't actually have control over the tools of music. So if you want to be a writer, composer like myself, and you want to be a performer, knowing when to play the right note for the right audience, you really have to understand what scales do to people, what chords do to people, what tempos do to people, and it sometimes it can only come from experience. Um, I spent a year playing with a disco band, so I got real life experience. Number one, being totally ignored while on stage, which was character building. Number two, understanding what tempos work at different times of the night. Very important if you want to be a performer, and and a working musician that keeps getting hired. If you're playing at a backstage, I'm sorry, backyard party, it's a smaller group of people, and you can probably see everybody's face, and so you're looking to see how loose everyone's getting. You're looking to see when you really need to play something familiar and when you can stretch things out because people are really reaching a fevered pitch. On a funny side note, I remember uh, before we were playing the Tokyo Dome in '88, I was playing with Mick Jagger, and at one point he was talking to me and Jimmy Rip, the other guitar player, and he said, it's a when you play places like this, he goes, it's a lot more about this than it is about this. And that was his simple way of saying, don't get hung up on just playing all these notes because person number 91,000 up there, they cannot hear it, they cannot see it. But if you do this and hold one note, you just made their year because they're going, he just waved to me when he hit that unbelievable note, you know? And it gives you perspective about what your job is as a musician and a performer. They're two different jobs, and within those two categories, there's many different categories themselves, subcategories. Like I remember opening for Metallica in Quebec City about 10 or so years ago. There were 120,000 people in this outdoor show. And we looked at the set list and we went, well, not doing that slow song. you know, that's not going to work because we were playing an hour right before Metallica came on stage, so we had to hit them pretty hard and make stuff pretty obvious.
Opening with surfing, yeah, it's got to be.
Just, and just, yeah, can just give them something. I think we did Always With Me, Always With You because we always need one thing that's extremely lyrical because we have no vocals, Um, and it really worked. And not everything always works. I mean, that's the beauty of it is that every show is a different show. But yeah, you do think about that. You do think about how you've got to think about tempos and intricacy if you're an instrumental. I mean, I'm in a really like subcategory of music, instrumental rock music. There's no chart for it on Billboard. There's no category in the Grammys anymore for it. I mean, so we can kind of do what we want, which is the freedom of being ignored. But I think the if someone buys a ticket to a Satch Vai show, they've come for a specific reason. We know they're part of our tribe, so you know we give them all we can, and we don't worry about those subtleties, I suppose.
Like the Satch Vai shows, the G3 shows, your solo, it's always been incredible. Now, you mentioned every night is basically a little bit of a pinch me moment here with Sammy and Mikey and Kenny.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Mick Jagger one. I'm assuming
Mhm.
that whole situation was a pinch me moment as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, what a crazy call to get, And I had just started this being a solo artist. I literally had been on tour for 2.5 weeks. I have to admit, I didn't know really what I was doing. I'd never played instrumental rock in front of an audience before. And suddenly there's three of us and we're playing two shows a night in these really small clubs. Really tough, losing lots of money. And I just was, I think the three of us were like, do we jump around like we're in a rock band or do we just act really serious? And so we somewhere in between we were doing something. But when I got a call, it was from a former manager who was uh, then working for Bill Graham Management, which were from the same town where I was living in San Francisco Bay Area. And so we both laughed when he called and said, "Hey, how would you like to audition for Mick Jagger?" I think we laughed on the phone for a minute, and then we said, "Well, I'm not going to get the gig, but I have to do the gig just so we can talk about it later. Have to do the audition." And but when I got the audition, I was totally shocked, and I thought, "Wow, now I've done it. Now I've got myself into something." but it was really interesting on so many levels. Besides the fact that meeting Mick was so surprising because he was so uh, genuine and funny and smart, and he was a great singer, totally relaxed, like he was just a guy in a band. But when he hit the stage, oh my God, he was like the best performer like ever. You know, I'd never seen anybody dedicate 100% of himself to the audience every single night for the entire 3.5 hour show. It was unbelievable. Most musicians aren't like that. You know, they really think of themselves more than the audience. But Mick thought about the audience every single moment that he was on stage. Off stage, he was really a lot of fun, and he was easygoing. It was remarkable to see that that was possible for someone that I had listened to since I was a little kid, and had written and performed all those amazing songs that part of my life. Um, so yeah, that was that. It's always been a pinch me moment every time I remember that. The two tours we did in '88. It was fantastic, and it had a big effect on how I looked at my solo career and what I was supposed to be doing, even though I was an instrumentalist. It The experience informed me quite a bit about how to carry myself on stage.
You stepped into Ritchie Blackmore's shoes for a good few shows there as well. Was that as
Yeah.
positive an experience?
It was, yeah. Again, it's down to the experience with the primaries. The experience with Mick was great because Mick was really fun. He was as good or even way better than you imagined, like in person. And then the quality of his humanity was really great. That's what you always hope for. You meet one of your heroes and they exceed your expectations. And with Deep Purple, it was the same thing. I had no idea who they were as people, and I thought, well, I'm just this American kid from New York. Like, what am I doing in this band? This legendary band. But they were so open to just letting me be myself, and as a matter of fact, they insisted upon it. And then, I've told the story many times that I had a week to prepare for the Japanese tour, and all I had were these cassettes that Roger had sent me from a show in Dusseldorf, where half the show Ritchie wasn't there because he had left. So it was an interesting set of cassettes to prepare myself for this tour. And we had one rehearsal in Tokyo before the show in this small, completely dead rehearsal room. And so I walk in there and I'm thinking, okay, this is really weird because this is Deep Purple. They're all right here standing in the room with me. And we play Highway Star in it, and they sound exactly like the record. That was mind blowing. Like everything from Roger down to Ian, they just sounded exactly like the record. Like every tonality, every part, the groove, the singing, everything. And the only problem was I didn't sound like Ritchie. So that was the biggest issue, was that my guitar just doesn't sound like Ritchie Blackmore's guitar. How am I going to get through with this gig? But they were fantastic musicians. They played together so well, and they really, what I didn't understand was, because I hadn't been following the drama, was all the problems they've had as a band since they started. I just never really looked into it, so I didn't know. I just thought they were tight, and all of a sudden they weren't. Um, so they were ready for somebody like me to come in with a different sounding guitar and a different attitude and different way of playing, and they just kept saying, "Be yourself, be yourself." So it turned out to be great.
Was there never the possibility of it continuing?
Yeah, they needed somebody to join, and that became more apparent after the first that Christmas tour in Japan. I had a few months off, where I had to go back to work on my solo stuff. And then I agreed to do the summer tour of Europe. Um, but it became apparent to them that Ritchie was gone forever, and that was something they had to deal with. So somewhere along that summer tour, Roger had asked if I would be interested in becoming a permanent member. But even though I was having the most fun, playing that material and playing with them, I still always felt like the odd guy in the band. And I thought, I don't know if, you know, and there was a thing that I had learned actually, playing with Mick Jagger, which was, even though it was great and it was successful and all the vibes were great, that Mick Jagger was in the Rolling Stones and the Rolling Stones weren't going anywhere. You know what I mean? They were going to be forever. They weren't going to dissolve and break up. And so, whatever crazy fantasies anybody else in the band, this Mick Jagger solo band had about being the new Rolling Stones or whatever they might be fantasizing, it was all just a fantasy. That sooner or later Mick was going to go back and to his real job, which is the Rolling Stones, right? And as fans, that's what we all wanted, really. Once we took our personal aspirations out of the equation, that made the most sense. And so when I was having a great time with Deep Purple, I just keep thinking, I'm Joe from Long Island. I'm not part of Deep Purple. And as a fan, I keep thinking, don't they want to find some British guitar player from the same generation, that we all want to hear, that somehow just makes it all work a little better. And I just thought, I'd be too disruptive. And on the other hand, I was also thinking, wow, I have a solo career. Like, why would I put that aside? The one thing that gave me the most amount of pleasure was being able to play my own music in front of people and having them respond to it. And I thought, I don't want that to go away. And I will never be able to play a Deep Purple gig and not have to play like Ritchie, because that's the gig. Let's face it. You know what I mean? He's one of the founding members, right? And
Absolutely.
so if you take that gig, that's the cross that you bear. And I thought, why?
So how has that informed the situation now playing Ed's parts?
This is slightly different because unfortunately Edward has passed away. So it's an entirely different thing. Like with Mick, the Stones were alive and kicking, and same thing with Deep Purple. Ritchie Blackmore could have just joined at any time.
Mm.
And plus, he was out there playing. I remember in the mid '90s, around 95, 96. David Lee Roth was called me and he wanted to put together a band to do Van Halen songs. And he went on and on about how that we were the only guys who could really do it right, and he had all these crazy plans. And I said, I, I said, but Dave, Ed's still alive. He's still making amazing records. He's still on tour. What guitar player would ever try to imitate him while he's still working? I said, it makes no sense. And of course, I said, look, I'm not the guy. Uh, so
Who
to
else
get
was
to
going to
get
be
it,
in this band?
I have no idea. I don't know. Dave has a lot of creative ideas, and every once in a while, yeah, he'll reach out, and you just have to listen to it. I mean, he really is a brilliant performer and musician, and so I kind of expect it. Um, when he and Alex had called me after Ed had passed away, it made a little bit more sense, even though I tried to convince them I was not the person who could do it justice. Because I said I've tried to avoid playing like Ed for so long that now I really can't. But yeah, I guess that's the main thing now, is that number one, it's not really a tribute band. It is a retrospective of Sammy's career, which is what it has always been, and that it's, you know, it is not a like a Broadway show, where somebody walks out with uh, striped overalls and frizzy hair and the whole thing.
So after Eddie Van Halen had passed away, this was David Lee Roth and Alex Van Halen reaching out
Mm,
to do a similar
yeah,
project, or was it just going to be a
yeah.
one-off show?
No, they wanted to do a tour,
Wow.
and yeah, we got really close um, to doing one show when New York City was having their big coming out festival after the pandemic. Um, and I rehearsed by myself for weeks, months, trying to figure out how I was going to do, and it was all David Lee Roth era stuff, um, which was really different. And so, um, and as I said before, a couple of times I called him and I said, "Really, are you sure you don't want to call Nuno or Steve or someone like was obviously more well suited to sound like Ed and has demonstrated playing this stuff live." And but they were adamant that I was the only guy who was going to do it justice. So I just thought, okay, I'll just keep working on it. And when it fell apart, I was kind of relieved, because I was really concerned about how we were going to do it justice as a show, top to bottom, and not reflect Sammy's period in the band, which was huge. I think they got more number one records and sold more records in general than the Roth era. So it was confusing to me that they wouldn't want to reflect that at all. But that's a whole other story that it's not my place to get into.
Could you tell me who they wanted to play bass?
They didn't know. Yeah, that was the that's why I suggested Jason, because they asked me and I was like, well, that's weird. It's got to be Mike. But they said, no, it can't be Mike. So I thought, well, I knew Jason was a really crazy Van Halen fanatic, and besides being an awesome bass player, and that he had so much experience playing in super large venues around the world. And we had bumped into each other now and then when we were recording in the Bay Area. That whole period took maybe I'm going to say 4 or 5 months for it to start, reach a fevered pitch, and then slowly descend into dysfunction until finally it was all off. And I mean, you have to understand, I was just still at home working on an album, and it would keep swirling around, and I'd get phone calls and hear about plans and all this stuff, but I had no control over it. Very different from my life as a solo artist, where I have control over everything. Here, I was in control of nothing. I was just the recipient of phone calls and messages, about what was going to happen. Um, so when it fell apart, I thought, well, great, this is better. If anyone's going to do this kind of a tribute tour, it should be Wolfgang. He's the only one who who people really want to see do it, and he's the only one who actually does it all right. He can do all of his dad's stuff, so it's like, why shouldn't he do it? And if he doesn't want to do it, then that's the end of that. You know what I mean? It should be his decision. But that was family business, and I had no business getting involved in that. And then Sam called, and he had a totally different idea. He said, I want to put a band together to do uh, Hagar, Montrose, Chickenfoot, and a lot of Van Halen from his era, and also to, tip of the hat to what he thought was the best parts of the David Lee Roth era. And, Sam's not one to hold a grudge. He invited everybody, Alex and Dave, to be a part of it in any way they wanted. Um, and so that made more sense to me, because then I could apply myself to Montrose, to Hagar's solo artist material, to, play a Chickenfoot song or two, play one of my songs, and then this really fantastic catalog of Van Halen songs. and then plus a new song. So it all worked out.
Obviously, Chickenfoot are effectively on stage for these shows. Could we see a new Chickenfoot record down the line? And also, I know you just did the Satch Vai record, but when are we going to see a new solo album?
Oh yeah. Well, let's see if we can. I doubt there'll be a Chickenfoot album um, with where Sam was. Thinking even a year ago, I think he's even more committed to enjoying life without having to work so hard, trying to recreate stuff that he's already done so many times since the 70s, so um, he deserves a good vacation now and then. um, uh, I think the Satch Vai album comes out October 30th, and we'll probably put out the last single October 1st. And that's totally in the can. Artwork, everything is all ready to go. And then I I do have to start thinking about another solo record, and I'm not sure when I'll get to record that, but I'm coming up with different ideas about where I would do it and with whom. That will be something completely different than what I've done before, which I feel like doing. Yeah, I feel like basically getting in a room, a big room with musicians and recording more in a live vein, more like the Extremist experience. Than the last couple of records. That's due to the pandemic, there was a lot of remote recording going on. So yeah,